Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we sit down with Kent Redfield, the Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Springfield, and talk about if Governor Rauner has ruined his reputation among GOP voters, whether the Illinois Supreme Court would approve of redistricting reform, and what we may see from both parties as the 2018 election cycle approaches. Following that, in 50 minutes, we run an encore presentation of our interview with Michael Burlingame, a Lincon historian and author of Lincon, A Life. We talked to Mr. Burlingame about President Lincoln's resolve during family and national crises, how close he came to defeat in the presidential election of 1864, and whether the Civil War was necessary. And finally, in about 1 hour and 45 minutes, as Halloween approaches, we run an encore presentation of our tour and investigation of the Legacy Theater in Springfield, which is said to be haunted by actors of days past. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Dennis Bringett, owner of Ace Sign Company in Springfield. I'm also a member of the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Business Development. We build brands through visual communications. We design and fabricate in-house with our team of 49 associates. For our customers, a great sign is a showcase of who they are. For us, it means jobs for our employees and the ability to reinvest in new equipment to meet the demands of the future. Because as a manufacturer, if you don't invest in your business, you're not going to stay in business. Success in business can be very rewarding, but it also can be very challenging. Unfortunately, governments can sometimes make it very difficult with new policies and regulations that can raise the cost of production, hiring, and taxes. That's why we need to know what's happening at the state capitol and what's being proposed that can impact Illinois businesses and our employees. So lawmakers also need to hear from us, the small business owners, about the challenges that we face. And that's what we get from the Illinois Channel's coverage, to hear from the lawmakers and the governor, but also gives a voice to those of us in business. I'm Dennis Bringett, president of Ace Sign Company, and proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Business Development. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us connected to the issues that matter most.
Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Kent Redfield, the Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Springfield, and talk about if Governor Rauner has ruined his reputation among GOP voters, whether the Illinois Supreme Court would approve of redistricting reform, and what we may see from both parties as the 2018 election cycle approaches. This runs about 50 minutes.
Kent Redfield, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Good to be here.
It's been a while since we had a chance to speak. You and I had worked together, or at least at the University of Illinois Springfield, for a couple of years when we were doing the Illinois Channel planning study, and you were there for many years. Just for a quick background for those who don't know you, so they can put some of the rest of your comments into some context. What was your career, and what were some of the areas of political science you focused on?
Okay, I started out at the university in 1979. I actually came here in 75 to work for the General Assembly. I staffed local government committees, and when I came out to the university, I did a focus on Illinois politics. I ran an intern program for the General Assembly where we place interns with partisan legislative staffs, and in the early 90s, I got involved doing research on campaign finance in Illinois, worked with a non-for-profit group for more than 25 years.
Is that the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform?
Yeah, the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. And
what was the goal? I mean, they're still around. In fact,
Sure.
Before I go off on that tangent, what was the goal and the objective of that organization?
Well, it's actually founded by Paul Simon and the first and Bob Custra, who was the lieutenant governor for Governor Edgar, and they wanted to open up Illinois' political system in terms of campaign finance reform, transparency, ethics issues, and so it was intended to be a bipartisan effort to kind of move Illinois politics out of the good old days or the bad old days that were in full swing when I got here in '75.
So more ethics, more transparency in government. I want to go more into some of the campaign issues of what we're dealing with now, but as you look back over those years since 1979, was any progress made, would you say?
Oh, we're much more ethical than we were, and after putting all the governors we put in jail, that might sound a little strange, but the standards that we apply, the openness that we have in government is much greater than back then. We don't have the petty corruption. I mean, we still have some major scandals, but over time we've eliminated a lot of the petty corruption. The culture has changed. It's not where it should be or where I would like it to be, but it's much better. But part of that is from the perspective of how bad it was back in the 50s and 60s and early 70s.
As somebody who's observed Illinois state government and studied it for close to 40 years now, how do you put into context where we are today? And where we are today, in my estimation, we have Republican governor, Bruce Rauner, and yet for recent actions, he is now being divorced, or many Republicans are divorcing themselves from him. Senator Kyle McCarter, conservative from Southern Illinois, has gone up and made videos on YouTube. You have Chris Roebling, who's a political commentator and Republican commentator, I should say. He's on WGN often, given his political analysis. About a year ago, I interviewed Chris Roebling, who said Bruce Rauner was the best thing to happen to the Republican Party in Illinois in 25 years, in part because of his money that he could make the Republicans competitive. And for the viewers, let me just the other day, Chris Roebling came out with an article saying that lambasting the governor now, kind of indicative of how many Republicans have changed their minds, saying that Rauner did not work with others. He did not stop our financial slide. He got nothing done. He lied to all of us. I'm reading from different segments here of his article. He lied to all of us by saying he would veto HB 40 and then doing the opposite. HB 40 was the bill that would allow for funding of abortions in Illinois, which Bruce Rauner signed. And Roebling says he played us for fools. Worst of all, he got nothing done, and said Bruce Rauner is damaged goods. He cannot win in 2018, therefore he should not run. So what are we to make, and how odd is this political, as we're on the eve of 2018, what will be a huge race for governor between the Democrats and Republicans in Illinois? What are we to make of this?
Well, it is, in some ways it's very surprising, but in other ways not. I mean, Bruce Rauner is governor because of the failure of Illinois politics, both Democrats and Republicans, over the course of I mean, things certainly started to collapse in the second half of George Ryan's administration, and he ended up going to jail, and Blagojevich made it worse, and he ended up going to jail, and Quinn when he was governor and the Democrats controlled the legislature, we really didn't address and solve those fundamental problems. And so Bruce Rauner is the result of the failure of politics. Wasn't a politician. He'd never run for public office. And there was kind of an implicit agreement that people knew that Bruce Rauner was not a social conservative. And certainly that's a big, that's one of the major groups within Republican politics are social conservatives. But Bruce Rauner offered the potential to come in and change the fiscal situation to, and be able to do things with unions, with business climate. And so there was this kind of bargain that was struck with the social conservatives that they would in fact back Rauner, even though they knew they weren't going to get anything they wanted on social conservative issues from him. They weren't going to get anything out of the Democratic legislature anyway. And therefore that seemed like a reasonable kind of accommodation. And so if people think back, one of the people that was a big funder and supporter of Liberty Principles PAC, which is Dan Proth's group, which is very active in the events we're just talking about, there was a guy named Jack Rozier. And Jack Rozier was an extreme social conservative, but he was also a fiscal conservative. And he reached an accommodation with Rauner and agreed to back him. And so you had this the part of a core group within the Republican Party that was saying, okay, the governor can, if we elect Rauner, he can get things done. And now you fast forward to this year, and we've passed a budget over the governor's veto. We passed the legislature did, and we passed a tax increase over the governor's veto. Now the governor, who never claimed to be a social conservative, has signed this bill about that provided Medicaid funding for abortion, and and therefore he is you get this huge reaction. We were willing to ignore all of this because he was going to get things done, and now he can't deliver. And so, I mean, the anger there is just amazing.
Many Republicans have said he outright lied to them, that he said he was not going to sign it. They're also angry with him for signing SB 31, which has been described by a lot of Republicans as making Illinois a sanctuary state, that police officers cannot detain someone based upon their immigration status. As we sit here then, how does Bruce Rauner get the nomination if people are just going to sit on their hands? And as Chris Roebling also said, his money won't matter because his commercials won't matter. People have made up their minds. So whereas normally having a whole lot of money would matter, it seems now that is not going to be the kind of thing, maybe a little bit like with Hillary. People had already knew who she was, made up their minds, and so you can spend a whole lot of money, but once people have their minds made up, it's virtually no changing of opinions.
Well, the governor does not, I don't believe the governor has a problem in terms of the primary. He has to have an opponent, and he has.
You think he'll have an opponent in the primary?
I still think that's likely. I don't know, and whoever it is will get attention regardless of whether they have any money or not, because people are going to be interested. It's part of the story, the civil war that's going on in the Republican Party.
Right.
And so. But he has enough money, he's got enough organization. You see him out there right now. He's running these soft, fuzzy education ads that kind of, here's all these great things that have happened in education, and this is what I can do, and Illinois is worth fighting for. Now, he obviously has huge trust issues with the Republican Party, and particularly with that core group of social conservatives who, I mean, they were willing to back the governor because they said, well, we're not going to get some of our issues. Now they view it as the governor's essentially rubbed their noses in the things that they really didn't want to happen in terms of the social issues. And if they were willing to forgive that, if he was funding the Republican Party, if he was getting things done in the legislature. Well, he obviously hasn't gotten things done. Now, we don't know, are people going to still take the governor's money? I mean, the governor's money comes into the Republican Party, and you're going to have candidates running in the fall, and some of them in the primary, that are going to have money from the Illinois Republican Party. But do citizens know that, say, last year, 96% of the money from the Illinois Republican Party came from Bruce Rauner and a fellow named Ken Griffin and another fellow named Richard Uihlein. Now, Griffin is a kind of businessman who's probably
He's as I believe, the wealthiest man in Illinois.
Yeah, and
an investor.
An investor, not a social conservative. This Richard Uihlein is very interesting because he's been a big backer of the governor, but he's also a primary funder of Liberty Principles PAC, which is Dan Proft's organization. And, there are connections there between that organization and John Tillman, who runs the Illinois Policy Institute and the Illinois Opportunity Project. It's
so there's just a handful of people with big pockets.
Yes.
Jack Roser, who you mentioned, passed away a couple of years ago. So now you got Rauner, Ken Griffin, Dick, I don't know if it's Uihlein or Uihlein, but a lot of people get his catalog, and I think it's Uihlein
yeah.
there. But,
oh, yeah.
And so we still have this, certainly in Illinois, and I suppose you could say on the national level too, it varies. You have the social conservatives, you have in the Republican Party, you have the fiscal conservatives, sometimes they're one and the same, but you also have those who are just fiscal conservatives and social moderates. I guess that's probably perhaps where Bruce Rauner would describe himself as, but how can he describe himself as a fiscal conservative? What do you make of him, the governor, pounding the table that he's not going to sign a budget until it's balanced, and in 3 years he never proposed a balanced budget?
Well, the governor strategically sat out in 2015 that first budget that was, had big gaps in it, and he said, he was betting he would be able to leverage the budget against his programs, that he could bring the Democrats to the table. And he did that for 2.5, 3 years, and finally, enough Republicans joined the Democrats to override his veto on a budget and on a tax increase. So
why did that happen? We had 15 Republicans, and it wasn't just that they were voting against the governor on the budget, but they knew that they were going to be ticking him off. I'm sure he communicated that to them, and here's a guy with all this money. And going back for a moment to what you had talked about, the Illinois campaign for political reform and trying to get, here we have a number of Republicans now who voted against the governor, deciding they're not going to run again because in part they can't fight his money. One of them, Chad Hayes out of Danville, had a very interesting letter when he announced he wasn't going to run again, using a reference, moneyed bullies. So what does it say about Illinois democracy? Maybe nothing different than has it been for years, but where we have so much money concentrated in so few hands. Maybe that was less true of the Republican Party before Rauner. You have it with Mike Madigan, the House Speaker, controlling the purse strings as far as, because he's also the chairman of the Democratic Party. So if people buck Madigan, they're not going to get funded in their campaigns. Now it's also fairly true of the Republicans with Governor Rauner. So I guess I don't know to what extent the average person's seeing these issues, which I'm trying to just say, what are we to make of this? And you got all kinds of people now, a large amount of Republicans certainly saying they're not going to run again out of the legislature. So you're losing a lot of experience. Give us your thoughts. I'm just trying to lay out a
Right.
series of things so that people can understand, I think, the landscape as we go into this primary season and then the general election in 2018.
Yeah, and we've lost a lot of Democrats that aren't running again. And so what you've got is gridlock starting in July of 2015 that lasted all the way up through this summer. We didn't fund all kinds of programs that people care about that needed to be funded, and so a very acrimonious, poisoned atmosphere between a Republican governor and the Democratic leadership in the legislature. It's no fun to be in the General Assembly, and it's not like fun in terms of having a good time. It's that if you're a serious legislator, then you want to represent your constituents, you want to solve problems, you want to make things better. And what we have done is run up the unpaid bills to $15 billion, when they were maybe $4 billion when we started. And we've done long-term damage to social programs, to higher education. And there just doesn't seem to be any end in sight. In terms of, if you end up with a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature after 2018 and it's Bruce Rauner, then, how are things going to be any different for the next 4 years? So, and then the fact that you have this concentration of power and money in the hands of the legislative leaders in terms of the Democrats, in terms of the governor, as far as the Republicans are concerned, then your ability to feel like you can represent your constituents becomes compromised. The fact that,
Should a governor, let's put it this way, have other governors controlled or attempted to control the Republican caucus the way Bruce Rauner has?
No, this is unprecedented, and to have it based on primarily on the campaign contributions, on running money through the Republican Party and into the caucuses. I mean, certainly Illinois has had periods of very strong party control, and on the Democratic side, but also on the Republican side. Pate Phillip was a very powerful Senate president who had a Republican caucus. I mean, he was a Republican from I think DuPage County, and that was very tightly controlled. Everybody complains about Madigan's rules in terms of the legislative process of it being very centralized. A lot of those were borrowed from Pate, were first instituted by Pate Phillip and the Senate Republicans, the decade before, and that Madigan became, came into control. So you've had party control, but to get this kind of to have it based in money, get Rauner's money on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, you look last cycle legislative races. You've got labor unions, you have big law, trial lawyer firms, and to a lesser extent you have health facilities, which are hospitals, nursing homes, who if state government spends a lot of money on health care, then they are primary beneficiaries of state government spending a lot of money on health care. And so, they are funding $50 million worth of legislative races, and the governor and Ken Griffin and Richard Ueland are funding $50 million from the other side, and then
and the winners are the TV stations and the advertising guys, right?
And if you know that the other side can come after you with big bucks, then you want to be friends with somebody on your side that has big bucks. And so you've had this escalation within the legislature. And if you look at this briefly, the governor's race, what makes a billionaire attractive to the Democrats? J.B. Pritzker as a candidate, never run for public office, haven't done too well the last 3 years with a businessman, being governor. Why would Pritzker be attractive?
I mean, you got another billionaire with no political experience, as we have with Bruce Rauner.
Right, but J.B. Pritzker can self-fund, and if he self-funds, then
and he can fund downstream as well.
Even if he doesn't, the Democrats, the
Can
big
use-
labor,
Can save their money to put on the
they
House
can,
races.
yeah,
right?
and that's, if we're making decisions on the basis of who gives us the best strategic advantage in terms of spending money rather than who's the best person to guide the state out of this mess, who can bring the parties and and get the public behind them to make the hard choices. That's that's what I think is particularly destructive about this is you're
So
losing
it might be interesting to
contact.
watch the 2018 election, without question, I think. On
Yeah.
the other hand, I want to get to how do we save
Yeah.
Illinois, or is Illinois just lost in this vortex of big money politics and big egos? What's the answer on that one? I mean, do we get to any solution to where, I mean, here, as you mentioned, we went basically 3 years without a budget until the Republicans voted to override their own governor because they were just so frustrated. I would add that Christine Radogno, who was the Republican Senate leader, went to John Cullerton, the Democratic leader, in essence saying, the governor's not putting together a budget, so why don't you and I do it? Then Rauner comes in and picks up the phone and calls the Republicans, who Christine Radogno had said to Cullerton, we'll put votes on this, and the governor interjects himself and says, don't vote for it, undercutting the Republican leader of the Senate. She, I think, mostly out of frustration with his rule, resigns from the Senate. And so nothing's getting done. I guess I'm kind of confused trying to follow all this. What is his goal? Do you have any inkling? Because if he doesn't propose a balanced budget, even though he demands that there be one, if he interjects himself when he verbally says, I'm for the grand bargain, but then picks up the phone and tells people not to vote for it, I don't know where we are or how anything. Illinois is in a crash dive, and who's going to step in to grab the reins? At what point does policy trump politics here?
Well, and it is the fact that the governor made a lot of strategic errors in terms of trying to leverage his position. He's clearly miscalculated. The governor knew that the state needed revenue, and it also needed serious budget cuts. I mean, we need to trim what we're doing to the essentials, and we have to provide revenue, and we should have a better, more broadly based way of getting that revenue. I mean, everybody knew that, and so he was trying to leverage essentially holding up the, crashing the state, or the prospect of crashing the state, as a way to get what he wanted, which were business reforms. I mean, he was always willing. He never said we don't need revenue. He may have at one point.
He was saying we need revenues, but we need reforms as well.
Reforms for, and so it isn't. It's about. It isn't about policy versus politics. It's about how do you get within the political system the kinds of compromises and agreements that you need in order to solve things, because that's the way the political system is designed.
Are we going to get that?
If things get bad enough, we got a little bit of that by Republicans coming over and saying, I'll sacrifice, in some cases, I'll sacrifice my career because, we need to get to the, we need to get beyond this impasse and then hopefully start talking about, what are the compromises. It isn't that we failed because of politics. We failed at politics. The design of the system demands that you reach accommodations. If you have gridlock, if you don't have consensus or compromise, the American political system defaults to gridlock. And the governor tried to use that gridlock in order to leverage what he wanted to accomplish. Again, an experienced politician, a Ronald Reagan, a Tip O'Neill, see that...
Or Jim Edgar.
Or Jim Edgar, and in this case, Mike Madigan, say, let's find some common ground, because if we don't, nothing's going to get done. Yeah.
I want to get, before we run out of time, I want to get to, going back for a minute, on the Republican primary. there's conversations. No one else has said they're going to run in the Republican primary as yet, but there's conversations about
Right.
various people being speculated. Some people say Jeannie Ives, who's a very conservative House member, she's a graduate of West Point. Other names are mentioned. My question is, in your estimation, for the sake of discussion, if the Republicans were to nominate a conservative, a hardcore conservative, given the political lay of the land in Illinois, can a hardcore conservative be elected statewide?
I think that's very difficult. I think Pat Quinn was not a great candidate, and running against. But he ran against Senator Brady, who was a downstate social conservative, and in a midterm election, Pat Quinn won. I mean, this state is very hard for a Republican to win in unless they appeal to moderate suburban voters, and I think you would have way too many wedge issues that you would use against a social conservative. That person would run great downstate. They would be terrible in Chicago, and they would lose. And they would, if they're all they're doing is breaking even in the suburbs, Chicago's going to outvote downstate every time because of the numbers that are involved. So I think it's very, very difficult. And if you got a social conservative, then we don't know who the Democratic nominee is. Assuming just kind of normal default sorts of things, then you get Mendoza versus Munger, the comptroller candidates from 2 years ago. Now, it was in a presidential election, and Mendoza didn't run as well as Hillary Clinton did. But when you don't, even with $10 million, people didn't know who was running for comptroller and what they did. So I think it's hard.
I sometimes look at the lay of the land around Illinois, and I tell people, in my estimation, Illinois has a geographic problem. In that, 2/3 of the population lives in the Chicagoland area. So much of a concentration of population that when Bill Brady ran against Pat Quinn, 2010, out of 102 counties, I believe Bill Brady carried 99 and lost the election.
Yes.
Which goes to show the concentration of power, the concentration of votes, and that results in too much political power being held in too few hands. If you look at other states, in Missouri, you got a Kansas City balancing a St. Louis, the power is diffused. Am I right? I mean, what is your read of that? I mean, because it seems to me the only 5 people that matter politically in the state of Illinois is the governor, the Senate president, the House Speaker, the mayor of Chicago, and perhaps the president of Cook County Board. Some people might say you don't even need to go to the Cook County Board president. So you have 4 or 5 people that are controlling primarily all the strings.
Yeah, and again, the economic activity and the population is certainly concentrated, and and when you get one party rule, that can that can certainly be a problem.
Why do we not have a Republican Party in Chicago? Practical. I mean, why is it that for 70-something years, Cook County almost votes as a block for the Democrats?
Yeah. We have Republicans in Chicago, but we don't have much of a Republican Party.
They're not competitive.
Yeah, organizationally.
I mean, the Soviet Union had more competitive races than we have coming out of Chicago.
And that used to be true of the suburbs for the Republicans. Now it's happening downstate as old-style Democrats, Southern Democrats retire, they get replaced by Republicans. We're going to get downstate's going to be more and more one party.
We have what I call the Truman Democrats. They're pro-military, socially conservative, but they're union guys.
Right.
The coal miners and others of Southern Illinois. But they've been switched for a lot of social issues, I would say, primarily.
Yeah. And the jobs have left. With deindustrialization of cities downstate, of urban areas downstate, the loss of mining jobs, and so We have real problems with regions. Regionals, we have regional conflict. We've got economic segregation and racial resegregation in the suburbs. And, we need leaders that are going to try to pull the state back together. I mean, downstate is important to Chicago, because of, the agricultural base, because of the transportation system. It's not like that we don't need each other in terms of the state, but it's so easy to polarize, to say, oh, it's just,
But it is concentrated power in the Cook County area.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's
don't
no
have,
question about
and we
it.
don't have any downstaters running, as we had a Jim Edgar running. Is it a mistake that those candidates who are running, I believe I'm right to say none of them picked a downstater for their lieutenant governor candidate?
And we had one that picked the mayor of Cairo, and that may have been Pawar, who just dropped off. But no, but you look at Kennedy, at Pritzker, and at Biss, and we're talking about, we're trying to win a Democratic primary, obviously, but still, it's about what's your base and where are the votes, and Rauner has a suburban.
Is it a political mistake for none of those candidates who have reached out to the Southern Democrats and to say, pick an Andy Menard perhaps as a running mate, or somebody who has some state experience, who knows the lay of the land, but also can represent, the people of downstate Illinois?
Well, I would like to see that. Obviously, as a downstater, I want to, I want to see more attempts to get to cross the lines that have been drawn regionally in the state of Illinois, because we have to, we need each other. We've got to solve problems, but we don't have, Illinois has always had trouble with an identity. We don't think of ourselves as, we think of ourselves as Chicagoans and suburbs and downstaters, and we don't have a common kind of, Illinois identity. And that's a disadvantage, because we're in this boat together.
I was going to say, who controls, who are the power outside of politics? Mm-hmm. In other words, outside of political office holders, let's say. Who are the power brokers? Is it business? Is it union leaders? I sometimes wonder why we talk about the bad business climate in Illinois. The Governor Rauner has made that a major point. Why do we not hear more from the business community in Illinois? We hear Greg Bays talking up for the manufacturers often on some of the issues that he champions. But you don't get, and we have, Illinois has some of the biggest businesses in the world.
No, we have a lot of very, very important companies within a variety of sectors. And, there's an Illinois Business Roundtable, and it's really a who's who. And, there were times where Illinois we had a huge fight over workman's comp in the 70s and into the 80s. And eventually, big business and big labor got together and worked things out, because it was hurting the state competitively. And we need people in those communities to come together, but we also need political leaders to bring them together. We had a time when the business community became very interested in education. Now, part of that was they wanted better people coming out of high school, to come into their companies. But you changed the landscape in terms of the education policy, because business got engaged, and so labor needs to get engaged, business needs to get engaged, health, the different sectors.
Does the average voter have a voice?
Well, it needs, yes, you need to be represented. You always have a vote. You always have a voice. The problem is when we pull the state apart into regions, then people think in those terms rather than, what do we need for the state? Why do we need a broad-based, revenue system? And then when you have redistricting the way that it is done in Illinois, it's Democrat and Republicans seeking advantage, and what gets lost is representation. It's the connection between the citizen and the legislator. So
I wanted to jump in just on that, because that's where I wanted to go. One of the things Governor Rauner wanted to champion, and he's given voice to it, I think a fair person would look at the governor's comments on redistricting and say he's right, that and to your expertise, looking at voting trends and good government and what you worked on in your career, how much is the redistricting, which again sometimes can be archaic enough that the average person doesn't see that, but the way we draw the political boundaries of the Senate races, the House races, they lump Democrats into certain groups, they lump Republicans on others, and a great number of these legislative races, at least in the past, you have incumbents running without any opposition.
Yeah, we take advantage, we will draw lines to give advantage to one party or another or to incumbents, and we'll minimize competition wherever possible, and then where there's competition, we want to put our thumb on the finger, our thumb on the scales in order to give ourselves the advantage. And when redistricting is about partisan advantage, then representation gets lost. The city of Springfield is represented by 3 state senators, none of whom live in Sangamon County. If I say, gee, I want to go to the Illinois Senate and I want to represent Springfield, I can't do that. Now, Springfield is large, has enough people to, be the center of a Senate district. It's that has coherence. People, where are you from? Springfield. What are you concerned about? Springfield in terms of economic development, being a vital area and stuff. People can get behind that, and so it's about representing people rather than partisan advantage.
You end up, as you mentioned, having very few House districts. Let's take or Senate. Mm-hmm. Very few House districts. The Republicans need a net gain of 9 seats, I believe, to take control of the House.
Yes.
But there's very few seats available that are even remotely competitive. They picked up 4 seats last time. With all the incumbents leaving, they're going to have a hard time, I think, holding on to what they have. Is Illinois, as you look at other states, I presume you've looked at other states just for points of contrast, are we less democratic the way we do things here than in other states?
Well, I think we're less
in terms of democracy.
Yeah, we're less representative. Yeah, no, I don't think we do a good job of doing legislative districts and House or Senate to focus on representing people, and that's that's a real problem. And when we concentrate power in the hands of the legislative leaders. And
the
governor and become so dependent on money, again, that carries the day. If you have a wealth primary, if you have to have a certain amount of money in order to be viewed as in any way viable, then you have a large group of people who might contribute who are never going to get into the ball game. Now, political parties used to do a lot of that. They used to do a lot of that in terms of, the goals were patronage and a bunch of other things. But, party organizations done correctly can, provide some of those, can take, you can use that organizational strength, and you don't have to be a millionaire or a billionaire to run. But right now, most local party organizations are very weak, and that allows people with money, organizations with money, to come in and pick candidates often that have, you get situations where the people in the local community, who they would put forth, never makes it to the starting line.
Let me, we're going a little longer, and I apologize, but let's just. The governor, one of the things that he backed, on the other hand, a friend of yours and mine, Cindy Canary, also backed this, and she's a lifelong Democrat, I believe. So you had Cindy Canary working on the same project that the governor of trying to get redistricting on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. Now, the Supreme Court struck that down for technical reasons. I mean, basically, they were saying that they were giving the Auditor General of the state duties that were not in the Constitution.
Right.
Pat Quinn might have had a point in his criticism when he said of that, basically, you guys could have passed this, you just made it too complicated.
Right.
If you had just written it simpler, it would have gone through. Is Quinn right, or do we also have to worry about politics in the Supreme Court? Do you, I mean, I'm asking you obviously,
sure.
But from your standpoint, would the Illinois Supreme Court sign off on a fair redistricting proposal that which had, I forget, far more signatures to get it on the ballot than were needed, like twice as many?
Right.
And what is your estimation?
Okay.
Can we have the population, Democrat and Republican, rise up and say, give us fair districts?
Yeah. The people that wrote the remap proposal wanted to take the legislature out of it. They wanted an independent commission, and they didn't want the legislature doing any of the choosing, any of the mechanics. The Supreme Court said no. But clearly you could design a process to produce an independent redistricting commission where the legislature was involved. You know, the public is always going to be more suspicious, but if the Constitution says, if you're going to do this, you have to have something that's clean, that just involves the legislative article, certainly you can design something. The key to that is the criteria. If you say that you cannot take party into account, cannot take partisan advantage, can't take incumbency into account, that you have to affirmatively try to represent communities of interest, geographic areas, political boundaries, then you've got criteria in there that you can go to the Supreme Court and sue. You can, there's judicial...
You can always challenge on anything.
Yeah,
right?
There's judicial review.
I guess the essence of my question, though, is do you think the Supreme Court, and I respect members of the court, but some people would argue, if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, that they're going to be political as well and vote it down because they don't want to change the status quo.
The current court, I don't believe that's true. I think that you have gotten, unanimous or nearly unanimous decisions on a lot of important things. Pensions was one of them. You did get a split on, but a strong majority to throw the redistricting proposal out. I don't think you get the kind of, there are 3 Republicans and 4 Democrats on the court, but they've been pretty bipartisan in terms of the way they've approached issues, and I don't view them as being an institution that has been corrupted by the politics. I mean, you certainly could not have contended that about the courts within Cook County when Mayor Daley was Richard J. Daley was in his heyday. I mean, he ran the legislative, executive, and judicial branches were all under, in Cook County, were all under his control. Separation of powers was irrelevant because, they controlled all 3 branches of government. That's not the case here.
It always seems like there's one last thing, but so let me say one last thing. Just last week, as we taped this, we had an unprecedented action in Cook County, which is the Cook County Commissioners voting to repeal a tax that had been put into place, the sweetened beverage tax, which was a real populist uprising, abhorring this tax, maybe because people could understand a tax on soda where some of these other things are a little bit confused and hard to get your head around. Does that vote stand by itself, or do you imagine that there's going to be an awakening, or is it more of a reflection of the kind of what the Trump phenomenon, that we just have so many people out there who feel so put upon by government that could the Cook County tax, and the example that was now voted out because there was such a public uprising, is that conceivably the match that lights a bonfire of public revulsion against over-control by government?
Well, I think that everybody should be encouraged by the fact that you had citizens. There certainly was an organizational support there, and the beverage people were funding a lot of the ads, but you really got pressure from citizens to the individual county commissioners, and that should that's positive, whether you agree with the outcome or not, because there you've got citizens or know who the decision makers are. They're county commissioners. They obviously communicated with them, and the county commissioners listened. And now they're going to have to balance a budget without the revenue, which some people are not going to like the cuts, or they're going to have to find something that is viewed as a fair way to fund it. But those are the kind of conversations that we ought to be having about what can we afford, how do we pay for it, and we need to get the citizens' voice has to go into that process. And so, I don't want that to be, it could turn out to be a whole bunch of things, but the essence of what we ought to be, how government ought to be working is there, that you have communication and awareness of citizens, communications with their decision makers, and that they listen and are responsive. But now we have to take the next step, which is that because we no longer have the revenue, then we got to put a budget together. We got to have a conversation about how do we fund things, and so I want citizens to be to talk about the things that they're angry about and communicate, but I also want citizen responsibility. I want citizens to understand that there are limits, and that one has to you've got to balance budgets, and you've got to make hard decisions about programs, about revenue. That's what we haven't done at the state level, is we've not had those serious conversations, and the people making the decisions haven't felt the pressure the way that it happened within Cook County. That's I like local government. Local government often works well if you get those things together.
All right, Kent Redfield, we went longer than expected, but we appreciate your thoughts.
No, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Dave Treader, president of the Federation of Independent Illinois Colleges and Universities. For years, Illinois was known around the world for the quality of its colleges and universities, and not just our public universities, but the many private schools that do such a great job educating more students annually than the publics. Schools like Bradley University in Peoria, Millikan University in Decatur, Loyola University in Chicago, and Northwestern University in Evanston. These are just a few examples of the schools that not only educate the next generation, but also serve as economic engines for their communities, with tens of millions of dollars in payroll and the purchasing of millions of dollars in local services. In fact, the combined economic impact of Illinois' private colleges and universities is over $20 billion annually. Collectively, these schools account for $3.5 billion in state tax revenues annually. Illinois' independent colleges and universities are a key pillar of the economy, bringing billions of dollars to the Illinois economy, as well as adding a cultural richness to our communities. That's why it's important that the state programs like the Monetary Award Program, which enables low-income Illinois residents to attend college in our great state, remain funded. And it's also why it's important for all of us to understand the economic impact of our colleges and universities have on the Illinois economy and our communities. This is why I'm also happy to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council on Higher Education. Their statewide, in-depth coverage of the issues that impact our economy, our government, and our cultural resources help to inform us all on the issues that matter. I'm Dave Treader, president of the Federation of Independent Illinois Colleges and Universities, and proud to be a member of the Illinois Channel Advisory Council.
As Illinois approaches its bicentennial celebration, the Illinois Channel takes a look at the people, events, and landmarks that make up Illinois' rich history. Next, from Springfield, We sit down with Lincoln historian Michael Burlingame and discuss his book, Lincoln, A Life, as well as the president's resolve through family and national crises, his close presidential defeat in 1864, and how Lincoln's death changed the future history of America. This runs about 50 minutes.
Michael Burlingame, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Well, thank you for having me.
You are the author of a 2-volume history of biography, I should say, of Abraham Lincoln called Lincoln, A Life. And tell us, how did you come to write this book? Each volume is about 1,000 pages. How long did it take you to write it, and why did you, with all the books that have been written about Abraham Lincoln, why did you decide to write another one?
Well, 25 years ago, I decided to write a book about Lincoln's inner life. I assumed when I wrote that book, when I did the research for it, that there would be nothing new, factual, to be said about Lincoln, that I would offer a new interpretation of familiar material. And so I drafted the book, which I published with the University of Illinois Press, called The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, which is a series of essays about his inner life, his relations with his parents, his relations with his children, and that sort of thing. I wanted to call it Shrinkin' Lincoln, but my publisher, the stuffy old University of Illinois Press, wouldn't let me do that. In any event, I wrote the book based on published materials that I had consulted at Connecticut College, where I was then teaching. But then I thought I really ought to do some original research in unpublished sources. And the very first day that I went and did original research, I discovered a great deal of new information, a whole series of interviews that Nicolay, Lincoln's personal secretary, had conducted 10 years after the assassination. And I was astounded at how much new information there was. And so I started poking around in lots of other unpublished sources and found lots more. And I published several editions of Lincoln primary source materials. And then I thought, well, somebody ought to take all this stuff and do a new cradle-to-grave detailed study, a new Sandberg, in effect. And I looked around, and nobody else seemed to be foolhardy or bold enough to do it. So I thought, well, what the heck, I'll do it. And I'd become interested in Lincoln in part because when I was a freshman in college, back toward the tag end of the Second Punic War, I had a mesmerizing teacher, David Herbert Donald, who was a leading Civil War scholar and a leading Lincoln scholar. And he took me under his wing and made me his research assistant. And I followed him from college to graduate school and did my work under him. And so he was the ultimate inspiration when I was a 19-year-old freshman. And if he had been a medievalist, I would probably be writing about the Middle Ages today. But that's how it got started.
So you were probably like then, first of all, you didn't anticipate. It wasn't like you said, I'm going to write this huge biography. You kind of backed into the project.
Right.
And we should say Carl Sandburg, of course, famously wrote, what was it about?
6 volumes.
6 volumes?
Right.
Back in, I guess, the 1930s, was it?
20s and 30s, yeah.
And that's, I often, in my own mind, equate your work to his, that it was so exhaustive of research. So, but you started off not necessarily being, as a younger man, just enraptured with Lincoln and committed to that. You probably had perceptions of him, as we all did, kind of just in passing as the 16th president and this cursory knowledge. As you delved into all this material and researched it, what did you learn about Lincoln, and how did you form the opinions you hold now of him as compared to what you held earlier in life and is probably typical of most of us?
Well, I think the most striking thing about doing original research on Lincoln in unpublished sources and newspapers and public records and archives and the like is that you find out that when Lincoln was a young man in his 20s and his 30s, he showed very little of the statesmanship that would make him a beloved figure and a great statesman in his 40s and 50s. In fact, as a young man in his 20s and his 30s, Lincoln was something of a hack politician. He was very gifted at ridiculing his political opponents, Democrats. Lincoln was a Whig. He poured sarcasm and ridicule over them, which was pretty standard brand frontier politics, but he was exceptionally good at it. And so it's very disappointing when you go through Lincoln's early career in his 20s and his 30s, particularly if you look at his unpublished journalism or his unknown journalism. it's well established that Lincoln wrote a lot for the local Springfield Whig newspaper and then Republican newspaper, the Illinois State Journal. But nobody that I was aware of had ever tried to track down all of those pieces that he had written and identify them. And so I did, and I picked out at least a couple of hundred that I was pretty sure were by him. And they tend to be very low-road ridicule of political opponents. One of them actually incensed a Democratic office holder so badly he challenged Lincoln to a duel, and that duel almost took place.
That certainly would have changed history.
It certainly would have changed history. And actually, the guy that challenged him to a duel then turned out to be a general in the Civil War, and a rather inept one. They were disappointed in Lincoln. But I was shocked to see that Lincoln was a relatively low-road politician in his early career, and then hard-pressed to understand how he could become the high-road politician of his 40s and 50s, and was struck by the fact that between those two periods there was a 5-year layoff when Lincoln essentially withdrew from politics. At the age of 39, he stopped running for office. He had been running for office ever since he was 23, and he had won elections to the Illinois State Legislature. He had won election to the United States House of Representatives. He had participated as an elector in presidential campaigns. Excuse me. But then he stops, and for 5 years he sits on the political sidelines. Dabbles a little bit in politics, but nowhere near the commitment that he had made earlier. And then, at the age of 45, he comes roaring back into politics as a high-road politician. No more ridicule of Democrats, no more low-road sarcasm and the like, but very high-road, principled anti-slavery orations. Great work on the anti-slavery cause. And I was hard-pressed to understand just how that happened. How does the low-road politician become a high-road politician? And so in my first book, I spent a good deal of time talking about how Lincoln was an example of a successful midlife crisis. Now, when we think of a midlife crisis today, we oftentimes think of a man running off with his secretary in a red sports car. Well, that does happen, to be sure. But the midlife passage for most men, modern clinical studies have suggested, is a period of profound introspection where you worry about, have I made the right career choice? Have I made the right marital choice? Have I devoted too much of my time and energy to pleasing the collective rather than developing my own interior resources? What do I want to leave as a legacy? What's truly important? And out of all that reflection and introspection can come tremendous psychological growth. Now, it doesn't always happen, but it seemed to me that Lincoln was a conspicuous example of a successful midlife crisis. And one of the unfortunate things about my research is that we didn't have much real information about Lincoln's inner life. He doesn't write intimate letters that really describe what's going on intimately in his inner life. Well, a little, but not much. He doesn't keep a diary. He doesn't write memoirs. But we know what he looked like going into his 40s, and we know what he looked like at age 45. And it seemed to me to be a dramatic example of how a midlife crisis can become a very fruitful period in a man's life, though painful, to be sure.
So we don't necessarily know, but he comes out, and this crisis, that the internal crisis, this transformation, parallels in a way the growing crisis at the national level.
Absolutely. Of
the cause of slavery and the divisions, and John Brown raiding
right.
and killing people in Kansas in the 1850s, you know, Buchanan, James Buchanan, who was the president just before Lincoln, is often picked as maybe the worst president because he sat there basically while America entered into this conflagration and he did nothing to stop it. Would you agree with that, and to what extent did Buchanan set the stage for the Lincoln presidency, and how much of a divisions that the southern states started leaving the United States even before Lincoln took office in March of 1861?
Right. Well, Buchanan's basic policy for dealing with the secession crisis, which began in November of 1860, and there was a period between November of 1860 when Lincoln won the election and March of 1861 when he took office, 4 months, when Buchanan had to deal with the fact that 7 states had pulled out of the Union and 8 more were threatening to. And Buchanan's basic policy was saying, dear God, don't let it happen on my watch. And Now, Buchanan, at first, during the month of November and into December, was pretty wishy-washy. He started to get a little more backbone when some of his cabinet members from seceded states withdrew, and they were replaced by people with more backbone. And Buchanan does write a message, his annual, what today we would call the State of the Union address, but was then called the annual President's annual message, in which he makes some pretty good arguments against secession, against the legality of secession. And in fact, Lincoln uses many of those arguments in his own first inaugural. But then Buchanan, after making very powerful arguments about why secession is illegal and unconstitutional, then says, but it's unconstitutional for the federal government to do anything about it. Well, Lincoln didn't feel that way, of course. So Buchanan did in some ways help pave the way for Lincoln's firm resistance to secession by having good constitutional arguments, but then lacked the backbone to really do anything about it.
As we sit here, we are approaching the 150th anniversary of Lincoln being assassinated. He was shot on the evening of April 14th, 1865 at Ford's Theaters. People, I'm sure, know from childhood. He died on the morning of the 15th, which oddly enough, perhaps from a historical context, was Good Friday,
Right.
when he was at the epitome of his popularity,
Right.
in essence just having won the Civil War, although some fighting continued. Why should we today still pay attention to Lincoln's life?
Well, Lincoln is worth paying attention to in part because he was a great national leader. He was the champion of democracy, the champion of national unity, the champion of freedom, and also a very eloquent exponent of American values. He should be really considered a kind of founding father, stage 2.0, a founding father 2.0. His eloquent exposition of what the United States stood for and how he viewed the Civil War, and this is often misunderstood. We tend to think of the Civil War as either a war to save the Union, to preserve national unity, or a crusade to abolish slavery. But Lincoln regarded it as something more than that. 3 weeks into his presidency, his secretary, John Hay, rushes into the office and says, Mr. President, the mailbag is full of appeals to you to free the slaves. And Lincoln says, well, that's an important issue, but I think an even more important issue is this, that this war is really about proving that democracy and self-government is not an absurdity. We are an experiment. The rest of the world is looking at us. Can common ordinary people be given a significant voice in their governance, and can that government really work? Does it really look good on paper but doesn't work in practice, or can it work in practice? And what we're doing in this war is trying to prove that democracy is viable, that it's not an absurdity. And I think the Civil War should be regarded, as Lincoln did, as a war to vindicate democracy, as well as to preserve national unity, and as well as to end slavery.
It's interesting as you say that, because as I try to run through my mind of what other democracies were in the world at that point, I can't think of any.
Well, Great Britain was the closest approximation, but it had just barely allowed its middle class to vote starting in the 1830s, and its working class didn't get to vote till after the Civil War, and an awful lot of conservatives in Britain and France and elsewhere in the world were rooting for the South, not because they liked slavery, but because they wanted the North to fail and thereby discredit the arguments that their liberal opponents were making, saying, let's overthrow monarchy and let's have democracy and popular vote and all that. So definitely, when Lincoln calls the nation the last best hope of earth, he calls it a nation worth fighting for. That it's because it represented the idea that common ordinary people can have a voice in their governance, that you can have a society where people are allowed to rise and socially and economically based on their talent and their virtue and their ability and their industry rather than their ancestry. It really meant a great deal to the rest of the world. So he regarded the war, and I think properly, as a major event in world history.
I think you can't write about the man without understanding the period, and so you, I'm sure, have a very good handle on what was going on in the world, or certainly in the United States, and the political trends there. We sometimes get this retro version of history where people will go back, and so many people, as you were just saying, think that Lincoln fought to free the slaves, and other people say, no, he was not for freeing the slaves. And there's a relatively famous line that I will paraphrase where Lincoln says, if I could save the nation and free the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the nation and not free the slaves, I would do that. That saving the nation, preserving the Union was utmost for him. What would you say to those who would say, Lincoln was not at all for freeing the slaves, that was just something he kind of did as a way of undermining the South when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation? It only applied to the southern states. Just address that issue, Julie.
Sure. The letter that you cite is a letter that Lincoln wrote, a public letter to Horace Greeley in August of 1862. Lincoln had already written the Emancipation Proclamation in July. He had told his cabinet a month earlier, I'm going to do this. I don't want your opinion on whether I should do it or not. I am going to do it. His cabinet said, why don't you delay it? We just suffered a great loss, and it would look bad if we were to issue an Emancipation Proclamation on the heels of a great military defeat. Let's wait for a military victory. So Lincoln was waiting to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, waiting for a Union victory, which came about a month later, that is in September. And while he was waiting, he knew that there was going to be a lot of white backlash. That the slaveholders in the
in the North.
In the North, right. There were 4 slave states that stayed in the Union: Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. So you got a bunch of slaveholders there, and they're not going to like the Emancipation Proclamation. And you've got a lot of pro-slavery people in southern Illinois, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Pennsylvania, and the like. They're not going to like it either. So you have to grease the skids for the Emancipation Proclamation. You have to prepare the public to minimize the white backlash. And one way to do that is to say, if an Emancipation Proclamation is issued, it will be strictly to save the Union. It will be a means to an end. It will not be an act of bleeding heart liberalism or humanitarianism. It's a cold, calculated, practical measure to help win the war. So that's the way he's selling the war. Now, Lincoln personally hated and loathed and despised slavery from the time he was young.
And we know that how?
Well, for one thing, he says that I've always hated slavery. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. I hated slavery as much as any abolitionist, but I thought slavery was on the way out on its own accord and we shouldn't rock the boat. But since 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, slavery is on the march and it needs to be resisted.
And it might have spread to the western states.
Right, it might spread to the western states. And so, and when Lincoln was, and there's good evidence to suggest that Lincoln wasn't just making that up, that he'd always hated slavery. For example, when he was a sophomore in the Illinois State Legislature in his second term, in his mid-20s, the Illinois State Legislature was asked by its counterparts in the southern states to condemn the newly revived abolitionist movement. In the 1830s, abolitionism really got going again after a long quiescence. And the southern states appealed, the state legislatures appealed to their northern counterparts saying, please condemn the abolitionist movement. And the Illinois State Legislature did so. Lincoln was in the House, and it voted 77-6 to condemn the abolitionist movement. So 6 members of that body had the nerve to go against public opinion. One of them was Lincoln. 2 of them went a step further and issued a statement in the Illinois House of Representatives Journal saying that slavery is based on injustice and bad policy. It's a pretty strong statement for a young man in central Illinois running for office. God wasn't going to win you any votes in 1837. And then in 1860, Lincoln's asked about his anti-slavery views, and he said, well, I spelled them out back in 1837. They're the same now that they were back then. And then when he was a young man in Congress, he was 30, in his late 30s, Lincoln goes further than most of his colleagues in anti-slavery activity. Congress was considering a measure to abolish slave trading in Washington, D.C., which was something of a national, to say the least, a national embarrassment. But Lincoln went a step further and wrote a bill and announced that he was going to introduce it to the House, abolishing slavery itself, not just slave trading. So he was really ahead of his party. Well, that caused an uproar, and his support for that bill waned, and he never did actually introduce it. But the fact that he would frame such a bill, announce that he was going to give it, shows that his anti-slavery views were pretty strong early on, and not just as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the like.
You had touched, and I want to get to the assassination here soon about that, but you had said you'd written the book, the biography of Lincoln, not intending to, but kind of easing into it, to find out, really to explore his nature, the outward the chronology of his life, the facts were well documented in any number of other books. If we met Lincoln, what would we find? What kind of, what strikes me, and I want to hear what you're going to say, but what strikes me as I look at him is that he seems to be a very isolated person. I don't know if he had close friends, and he suffered such tragedy throughout his life that, especially during the Civil War, when you would think just the burden of that alone. But all that he went through, I don't know how the man's spirit maintained itself and how he just wasn't crushed by the loss of his children, the bad marriage, all that was going on. Do you yourself understand that, or are you yourself confounded as how could one man with such a crisis going on both in his personal life and perhaps the greatest crisis ever to face the nation, I think that would be true. How does one man bear up under that load?
Well, I think one of the striking things about Lincoln is his remarkable psychological balance and strength. It's common to think of Lincoln, and when people think of Lincoln psychologically, as thinking, well, he suffered from depression, which is true. And on 2 occasions he was so depressed, his friends were fearful that he would commit suicide. And there was good reason to think that.
About when was that?
Well, the first was with the death of Anne Rutledge, his sweetheart, when he was in mid-20s. And the second is in 1841 when he broke his engagement to Mary Todd. And on both occasions he was deeply depressed and friends worried about him. He had a tendency to depression later in life, but never the kind of intense, what we'd call clinical depression that he suffered on those 2 occasions. But there's a lot more to Lincoln psychologically than that. The fact that he was able to become this exceptionally rooted, psychologically mature and whole person, thanks to his midlife crisis. And the hallmark of a psychologically mature person, among other things, is his ability to overcome the petty tyranny of the ego. Now, we all tend to have needy egos, and that's particularly true for people in politics and show business. Although some people might say academe too, but that's not true. And anyway, but Lincoln was able to overcome his ego. He refused to take things personally. He would not. People would disagree with him. They would criticize him, and he wouldn't allow that to poison relationships. So he was able to get along with all kinds of people: generals, editors, congressmen, senators, justices, lawyers. And if he hadn't been able to do that and to keep the North united, the North never would have won. So I make the argument that Lincoln was really the secret weapon of the North, that the South could well have won the war if a more traditional kind of political figure had been at the helm. For example, if Jefferson Davis had been president of the North and Abraham Lincoln had been president of the South probably would have won the Civil War, because Davis was a prickly egomaniac, like many another political figure, and took criticism and disagreement personally and quarreled with his cabinet, and he quarreled with his vice president, and he quarreled with his Congress and with almost everyone, whereas Lincoln wouldn't do that. And one of my favorite Lincoln quotes is illustrative of that quality of Lincoln's. In 1863, he took time from his busy schedule to write to a young Union captain who had been squabbling with his superior officers. It was a guy named James Madison Cutts. And Lincoln said to him and he quotes from one of his favorite authors, Shakespeare, and he quotes from Hamlet. He tells this young man, quoting from Polonius' speech to Laertes in Hamlet, that speech where Polonius says, "Neither a borrower nor a lender be, and to thine own self be true," and all that. Lincoln says, "The advice of a father to a son," and then he quotes from Hamlet, "beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it, that the opposed may beware of thee." Lincoln says that advice is good, and yet not the best. Quarrel not at all. No man determined to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield greater things, to which you can show no more than an equal claim, and lesser things, though clearly your own. Better to give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. Well, that's great advice. It ought to be on every gold letters on every college, university, post office, courthouse in the country. And Lincoln was one of those rare people who can not only give good advice, but he could act on it. He refused to quarrel. He refused to take criticism personally. He refused to take disagreement personally. And I think that's remarkable for most people, but particularly for people in politics.
Yeah, I was going to say he always seemed to have a psychological viewpoint where he saw the big picture,
right.
And the big picture is what mattered, and
Absolutely.
He wouldn't allow himself to be drawn into the minor details.
Absolutely. His understanding of his job was that the North will win the war if the North stays united. The North will only stay united if the radicals and the moderates and the conservatives in the party are kept working together, and the slave states of Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware continue to work with the abolitionist states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and that his job was to keep all those people working together, and he did it brilliantly.
People wonder in any position in leadership or just in their own private life, to what extent do I hold firm to my principles, and to what extent do I compromise? And when I compromise, am I selling myself out? Lincoln certainly had to compromise on any number of things, both in the war and in politics, to win favor from people. How did he handle that, riding the fence of when to hold true to your own principles and when to compromise to accomplish a larger goal?
Well, Lincoln was willing to compromise, except on basic principles. He said that basic principles must not be compromised. For example, during the secession crisis, Lincoln said he was willing to bend over backwards to accommodate the South, except on two issues. One, slavery was wrong and must not be allowed to expand. And there was a lot of pressure on him to support a compromise which would have allowed slavery to expand. And he said, no, that cannot be compromised. And second, secession. There's no compromise on secession. But otherwise, he was willing to say, okay, I'll go along with modifying the personal liberty laws in the North, and I'll even support a new constitutional convention. And
really, he would do that?
Well, that's he said. There are two ways to amend the Constitution. The one that we're all familiar with is the 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states. But also, the Constitution says you can just call a new convention. So he was even willing to do that, even willing to support a 13th Amendment which said the federal government shall not tamper with slavery, which he thought was already in the Constitution to begin with. So that would be a way to throw a sop to the South, but without really making any significant concession. But on those two principles, secession is illegal and must be resisted, and slavery may not be allowed to expand. Otherwise, I'll compromise.
A lot of people watched the movie Lincoln. I think you were an advisor on that, were you?
I was an advisor on the movie Lincoln, right.
How accurate was that movie?
On the whole, it was quite accurate. A couple of episodes, like the slapping of Robert, was pretty unconvincing. And the business where he stands up and says, I am the President of the United States, clothed with immense power, and you will get those votes. Lincoln wouldn't have done that. But otherwise, I think it was pretty good.
You know, what strikes me is, then, speaking of compromise, and Lincoln, in my mind, would be a man who was willing to suffer fools as long as he, again, just could get the object of whatever his goal was accomplished. So he was dealing with McClellan, who was haughty and would not show the president respect, the first Union national leader of the Army. Ultimately, he fires McClellan and goes through a series of generals that just didn't work out until he eventually puts Grant in, which I guess was 1864 when Grant came to power. Tell us about that. What kind of a war general was it, and to what extent, again, a lot of times we have criticisms of modern-day presidents of interfering with the generals, and the advice is, let them do their job. You're the president, not a military expert. And yet Lincoln would kind of, again, ride that fence, where he would both let them have their way for a while, but then become very frustrated, like with McClellan, that he wouldn't fight, that he was saving his army, and he didn't know for what. How would you rate Lincoln as a wartime president?
Lincoln as a wartime president, I think, rates very high. And it's partly because he was able to convince his electorate, the people of the North, that he really, really cared about the war. His heart was really in it. And he had a kind of steely determination to win that war. And that steely determination he managed to infuse into the Northern public. Now, we tend to think of Lincoln as a magnanimous fellow, somebody who would restore a bird to a nest that it had fallen out of, or rescue a pig from the mud, and would bend over backwards to find excuses for soldiers who were condemned to death by firing squad, which all that's true. But also, inside Lincoln was a very strong core of iron determination to win that war, because he thought the stakes were so high. And people sensed that. And also, he kept reminding people why this war was important. And that's an essential quality in a war leader. You have to keep, in a democracy, you have to keep the public on your side to make sure the public understands that this war is worth fighting, that the taxes that you're going to have to pay, and that the sacrifices that you're going to have to see with men and husbands and husbands and sons and brothers and uncles killed and wounded. And Lincoln was supremely gifted at reminding the public of why this war was so important, why the stakes were so high. And he did it not just at the Gettysburg Address or in the second inaugural, but in his first message to Congress and his second annual message to Congress, and time and again stressing how important this war was, not just for national unity and not just for abolishing slavery, but for vindicating democracy, for making it possible for government of the people, by the people, and for the people to survive on the world.
You know, another parallel I often see is in going back to Vietnam as an example. 100 years after the Civil War, we got stuck in this quagmire. We thought it wouldn't be anywhere near like what the war lasted and went on for years, like 7 years. And the death count went up, and the people turned against the war in Vietnam. They can, if they remember that. Much was the same in the Civil War. We didn't expect it to be so long,
right.
And yet it went on, became bloodier and bloodier, and the people of the North, many of them were turning against the war, and were like, for heaven's sakes, let the South go. It's not worth all this bloodshed.
Right.
When you talk about Lincoln reminding the people why it was so important, for one thing, in that day and age, he couldn't go on and do a national address on television.
That's true.
How did he communicate that from the White House, given the communication means of the day, and how close was he to being defeated in 1864, given when he ran for re-election? And had he lost that election, one of those running against him was McClellan, who had been the Union general in the beginning, who was willing to say, we'll let the South go.
There are two things to your question. In 1864, it looked as though Lincoln was going to be defeated for re-election, because the military stalemate in the summer of 1864 was very disappointing. And huge numbers of casualties had been taken in the spring and the summer, and yet no progress seemed to have been made. And so Lincoln was convinced that he would probably lose, and told his cabinet, and actually had his cabinet sign a document saying, well, we'll help out the new president as best we can between the time of the election and the inauguration. Mercifully for Lincoln's re-election campaign, shortly after that, in September, the Union starts to win major victories, capturing Atlanta, winning victories in the Shenandoah Valley, capturing Mobile Bay, and the like. And so that turned it around. So it was something of a close call. And the technique that Lincoln used to get his message out was not press conferences, not going around the country giving speeches, but by writing public letters. Lincoln was a brilliant writer. One of the great literary critics of recent times, Edmund Wilson, said that he was probably the only American president who could have made his living as a writer. Jefferson fans may disagree, but certainly Lincoln was a brilliant writer. And he wrote public letters, which was a new innovation, but got published in newspapers.
Would they be addressed to an individual, or was it an open letter to the public?
Well, these public letters would vary from case to case. The famous letter to Horace Greeley was obviously written to a newspaper editor who had written some editorials that he was responding to. Then he would write, if there was a protest meeting, for example, in Albany in 1863, a bunch of Democrats condemned the way in which Lincoln had suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus and so on. And so he writes a response to them. And then a newspaper editor in Kentucky meets with him and complains about the emancipation policy and the arming of blacks soldiers and Lincoln writes him a public letter in which he defends those policies. And out here in Springfield, he's invited in 1863 to come to a big Republican rally. Well, he can't make it. He's busy in Washington, but he sends a public letter defending his policies and his administration in general. And those public letters, in addition to his speech at Gettysburg and to his messages to Congress, formal state papers, eloquently out, and these then got picked up by the newspapers. So Lincoln, through the press, was able to get his message out. And he also had his secretaries write anonymous journalism defending the administration without acknowledging their authorship. And I discovered that. That was one of the little contributions I made.
Interesting that he had that. And did that, we didn't have public opinion polls of the day, right?
No, there were no public opinion polls.
So how do we know that strategy worked, these letters being read by the people?
We know in part because people who were affected by the outcome, people who were candidates or party leaders, said, "Well, your message, your letter to Greeley, your this, that, or the other, really helped us win that election."
We saw, again, going back to the movie, in January of 1865, and to remind the viewers, in those days, the president was elected in November, but wasn't sworn in until March the 4th,
right.
not January at that time. So between the time Lincoln was reelected and he was sworn in for a second term in March of 1865, he passed in January the amendment that outlawed slavery.
Right.
In January, April 14th, he's shot of 1865. He dies on the morning of the 15th. So we only saw that little inkling in January, a momentous occasion of Lincoln's leadership for a second term.
Right.
I know I'm asking you to speculate, but you probably have. What did we lose in Lincoln's assassination as a nation? How did that change the future history of the United States of what might have been?
Well, Lincoln's assassination occurs 3 days after he gave a very significant speech. On April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders. The Civil War is virtually over. 2 days later, Lincoln gives a speech at the White House to a large crowd. And it was a very important speech. People expected it to be an exercise in national self-congratulation. Let's hear it for the Army. Let's hear it for the Navy. We're number one.
Now, can I say?
Sure.
Doesn't he come out to a balcony and address the crowd?
Yes, he comes out to a balcony.
Was that a prepared speech, or was this an off the cuff?
Yeah, he prepared the speech. So in this speech, Lincoln dramatically shifts his views on how the South shall be readmitted. He had outlined a policy of Reconstruction back in 1863, at the end of the year, which was very moderate. That is, the South could come back in to the Union and have full participation in presidential elections and electing members to Congress and the like, if they just would throw down their arms, surrender, accept the abolition of slavery, but that's that. He was criticized by radical members of his party, the left wing of his party, by saying, well, you've got to do more for black citizenship rights. And Lincoln, in private, obeyed that, and he wrote to the governor of the newly established Reconstruction government of Louisiana saying, you're going to have a constitutional convention. I think it'd be a good idea if you would include in that new constitution for the state of Louisiana a provision allowing black people to vote, at least those who had served in the Union Army and those who were very intelligent, by which we assume he meant literate. But that was in private. That was in early 1864. Now, on April 11th, 1865, he makes it public. He says, I believe that some black people should be allowed to vote, at least those who served in the Army and the very intelligent. Now, Frederick Douglass was in the audience that day, the great black abolitionist, and he said that when he heard that speech, he and his friends were disappointed because of the limited scope of that proposal, just the soldiers and the very intelligent. But Frederick Douglass said later, I should have realized that it was a very significant speech because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge, and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. Having done that, then you drive home the thick edge of the wedge with a maul, with a big hammer. And that's what Lincoln was doing. That was the thin edge of the wedge. And we should have known that once he inserted the thin edge of the wedge, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And that's a brilliant image, and I think it's true. And so Lincoln would have really been a much stronger advocate of black civil rights than his successor, Andrew Johnson, to be sure. But there was a young man in the audience who did realize how significant that speech was, and that was John Wilkes Booth. And when he heard Lincoln say that he believed black people should have the right to vote, at least those who had served in the Army and were very intelligent, he turned to his companions who had been involved in a failed plot to kidnap Lincoln and said, "That means nigger citizenship. That's the last speech he's ever going to give. By God, I'm going to run him through." And 3 days later, he carried out that threat. And one of the things that I think people don't fully realize is that Lincoln was murdered, not because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which is here on my tie, which abolished slavery in the southern states, the seceded states, the Confederacy, not because he supported the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery everywhere, not just in the Confederate states. He was murdered because he called for black voting rights. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to think of Lincoln as a martyr to black civil rights, as much as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or Viola Liuzzo or James Reeb or Mickey Schwerner or Andrew Goodman or James Chaney or any of those people who were killed in the 1960s as they championed the civil rights revolution of our time.
Yeah, it's hard now. I grew up in the late 50s and 60s, and for those who didn't live through that, really, I would say the attitudes, the racial attitudes, hadn't really moved a whole lot in 100 years.
Right.
As we approach the 100th anniversary of the Civil War in the 1960s.
Right.
Until we had the rise of Martin Luther King and all that happened following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Then.
Right. Right.
One would have thought then, therefore, that would have been entirely different. In retrospect, wouldn't slavery have fallen at some point over that between the 1860s and, say, the 1940s at some point as we moved into a modern era? And was the Civil War necessary for those who question it?
Well, some people regard the Civil War as a needless effusion of blood. 750,000 or so men died in the Civil War. That would be the equivalent of 7 to 8 million today dying in a war. And some cynics have said, well, before the Civil War, black people were held to personal service and agricultural stoop labor in the South, and they lived in cabins that were close together. After the war, and after the failure of Reconstruction, black people were confined to agricultural stoop labor and personal service, and their cabins were far apart. And that's what the Civil War brought, separation of cabins. But that's not true. As a result of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery. As a result of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment got passed, guaranteeing civil rights, not just for blacks, but for everybody. Thanks to the Civil War, the 15th Amendment got passed, guaranteeing blacks voting rights. Those amendments made possible the civil rights revolution of the 20th century. That would not have been possible. The civil rights revolution of the 20th century couldn't have happened without those amendments. Now you might say, well, public opinion had changed. Well, yeah, public opinion had changed with regard to women's rights too. But what happened to the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s? Went down. Why? Because all it takes to block an amendment is 1/4 of the states plus one. And so there would have been a terrible constitutional crisis in our own time, or my own time anyway, or back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, if those amendments hadn't been there. And those amendments were made possible only by the Northern victory in the war and by the Republican Party then insisting that the South couldn't come back into the Union unless it passed the 14th Amendment and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Yeah, coming out of a war like that just after World War II, I think there's a great national consensus, one, because everyone has collectively experienced this event, in that case the Civil War, and then secondly, I think that you don't want to go through that calamity without feeling that you've resolved it to some extent, and so given that foundation, those amendments could have been passed.
Right.
Before we close out, I meant to ask earlier, we talked just about the interior thinking of Lincoln and his character. It struck me, and one of the fascinating things about him is that here's a man who was raised on the prairie, had very little formal schooling, and yet, as you know, was had a brilliant mind.
Right.
And one of the things that struck me is if people would read the Cooper Union speech in, what was it, about 1859?
1860, yeah.
So as I understand the history, and I maybe, so we had the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates here,
Right.
which raised Lincoln to a national figure because it was
Absolutely.
so well covered.
Absolutely.
And then the people in New York, my interpretation, the money people thought, maybe this guy could be president, but we want to check him out. So they invite him to give the speech. And if one reads that speech, you see what a great legal mind he had, that he could say, here's the argument for slavery, but then he dissects it
Yep.
and eviscerates the argument.
Right.
And I thought, to just give that extemporaneously, not that he didn't write it, but I mean, there's no teleprompters.
Right.
And he stands and gives a rather long speech.
Yeah.
But the legal mind that he had that was so sharp to take that apart, that, and as you said, he could write in a letter and relate to the great classical works. What do we make of that? I mean, was he an anomaly? I mean, how many people could have done that, especially one who hadn't gone off to a Harvard or a Yale and been one of the privileged families of his day?
Right. Well, one of the striking things about Lincoln, which we tend to underestimate, is that he had a very powerful, logical mind. We tend to emphasize his magnanimity and his humor and his humanity, and all those are important. But he also has a very powerful, logical mind. And he loved, for fun, in his 40s, when he was traveling around the legal circuit here in Illinois, he would have something to read, and it was the first 6 books of Euclid. He mastered geometry, the powerful logic of Euclid's geometry, for fun while he was traveling around the circuit. And that was emblematic of his powerful, logical, analytical mind. And that is particularly vividly illustrated in the Cooper Union speech, which is a piece of brilliant historical analysis based on logic and research, which he did in Springfield at the State Library. So it is a quality of Lincoln that's hard to explain. I mean, he had a hard time thinking himself, where did I get my intellect? Because his mother, who died when he was 9, didn't seem to be particularly brilliant. His father, from whom he was estranged, certainly wasn't. And so Lincoln fantasized that he had a grandfather who was a Virginia aristocrat, who was probably smart and capable and all that, who had seduced his grandmother, and that Nancy Hanks was the result. Lincoln's mother was the result of that union. And so he fantasized that he had this distinguished Virginia aristocrat as a grandfather, and he got his intellect and his ambition and his other characteristics from him.
Fascinating that he saw that even as himself outwardly, that this is an unusual capability I have.
Well, yeah, that he was so, his mind was so keen, and he was so smart that he had, and he couldn't account for it. His father didn't have those qualities, and he didn't know his mother very well because she died when he was 9.
It might have been also, I guess, one of the things that, am I right that he was somewhat of an isolated person? That certainly would have isolated him.
Well, Lincoln was a funny combination of reserve and good humor. He had lots and lots of friends, and he loved to tell funny stories, and he was very engaging. But the number of intimate friends that he had, with whom he could really let down his hair and share his innermost thoughts, was tiny. Joshua Speed, the guy that he bunked with and lived with in Springfield for 4 years when he first came to town as a young lawyer, was one. But that's about it. But there was a certain reserve. He was very friendly, very approachable, very accessible, but you always sensed that there was a kind of reserve. You didn't go beyond that. And lots of people commented on that.
As we'll close out, I would just say, let us have you read the last paragraph of your book, because Lincoln suffered so much, so many losses. Again, the loss of a child here in Springfield. Was it Willie or Tad that died in 1862?
As Willie dies in the White House.
At
And that
11.
was a terrible blow, because Willie was the favorite child. Most people will tell you they have no favorite children, but everybody does. And Willie was the favorite. And Mary said that. So one of the things that I try to emphasize in my writing and my teaching is that, that Lincoln is oftentimes held up as an example of how in this kind of society people can rise economically, socially, and so you can overcome, as Lincoln did, grinding poverty and lack of educational opportunity and the like. All that's true. But I would like to emphasize, too, that Lincoln is an inspirational figure, at least for me, because he overcame so much psychological malnutrition. When you think about how little emotional support he had a very distant relationship with his father. His father was not a sympathetic person. His mother dies when he's 9. At the same time, his foster grandparents die. His siblings die, one in infancy and one in childbirth when Lincoln was in his teens. Then his sweetheart dies. Then he suffers from depression. Then he has this awful marriage. And that he was able to overcome all that and become psychologically whole. I think all of us can be inspired by that. And so I'd like to read you just my final paragraph from the book, Abraham Lincoln, A Life, to illustrate that. Lincoln speaks to us not only as a champion of freedom, democracy, and national unity, but also as a source of inspiration. Few will achieve his world historical importance, but many can profit from his personal example, encouraged by the knowledge that despite a childhood of emotional malnutrition and grinding poverty, despite a lack of formal education, despite a series of career failures, despite a miserable marriage, despite a tendency to depression, despite a painful midlife crisis, despite the early death of his mother and his siblings, as well as of his sweetheart and 2 of his 4 children, he became a model of psychological maturity, moral clarity, and unimpeachable integrity. His presence and his leadership inspired his contemporaries. His life story can do the same for generations to come.
And Michael Burlingame, we thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members.
Hello, I'm Michael Jacoby, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. Most people never look at a school and think of it being an economic enterprise that spends tens of millions of dollars every year. They look at the school as a place their children attend for education, or perhaps as a place to attend a local sporting event. But handling the business of education is the job of the school business officials. We're the ones that keep track of the millions of dollars that come in and go out. Our members face a myriad of issues that include financing new buildings, paying teachers and staff, tracking our pension costs, and supervising the many businesses that contract with local schools. And that's why I'm so happy to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel connects us with legislators working on educational issues in the state capitol, as well as covering educational issues being discussed at conferences around the state. As we see in the debate over pensions, the many details involved in just that one issue, we need a news organization that's willing to give enough time to cover an important issue in depth. I'm Michael Jacoby, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. I'm also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us connected to the issues that matter most.
It's good news for theater fans that after 8 years of sitting vacant, Springfield's Legacy Theater is once again the home of musical reviews and stage plays. The theater opened in 1951 and for decades served as a top draw for fans of live theater. But since its recent reopening,
There are a number of reports that the theater is a home to more than live entertainers. Increasingly in the back rooms and backstage, there are reports of paranormal activity. No one really knows what's behind the odd happenings here, but some think the spirit of a past performer now haunts the Legacy Theater.
There was a gentleman that used to be an actor here in the 1950s that committed suicide, not on the site, but at another location. A lot of the folks that frequent the theater center or even work here believe that his spirit is one of the spirits that roam the building here.
And during one production, which I believe was called Mr. Barry's Etchings, Mr. Neville chose to end his life. And as the legend goes, because he did not get to go on for that production, he still resides at the theater.
Legacy Theater owner Scott Richardson says since the theater reopened, he's not seen a ghost, but has had some very odd things happen.
Shortly after we purchased the building, I'll say maybe 2 weeks later, I had a meeting with a group of landscape designers here to look at the courtyard, and sent them on their way, and came back into the building, which I'd been in a dozen times over the 2 weeks, and I came into the auditorium to see if any lights were still on, and as I glanced around, my gaze fell upon a piece of rolled up paper under the last row of seats in the back of the auditorium. Now that wasn't there before. I know that. It was not there. And so I reached down and picked it up, and it was the original landscape plan from the building from 1967, I believe it was.
Others talk of hearing approaching footsteps on stairwells that are then empty when they go to see who's there. These reports are what drew paranormal researchers Larry Wilson and Chris Mason to begin investigating the Legacy Theater. Together, they have nearly 20 years' experience investigating paranormal activity around the Midwest. And they've come across some hauntings that frightened even these experienced investigators.
We were setting our equipment up, and I had only brought a video camera that night and a tripod, and I already had my equipment set up. So I was facing the group as they were setting their equipment up, and all of a sudden, it was like I knew there was something watching me, but we were surrounded sort of by, there's a timber around the cemetery. And I felt like I was being watched, so I kind of started looking around at eye level, didn't see anything, and still kind of chatting with the group. And it just got like overwhelming. So finally I turned around, looked behind me, and my eyes went down, kneeling down on the ground was what looked like, it was dressed like you would see a monk. It had a brown robe on, hooded robe. It was kneeled down, but where the face was, it was completely smeared, and it was like a gray smear, like someone took finger paint and just smeared out the face, looking directly at me. And I yelled a choice word, and then look, and yelled a choice word again. And when I yelled, this thing, it took off, but it didn't walk like you've seen ghosts in the movies will take off walking, or it didn't exactly float, but it just kind of took off like you would see a witch in a cartoon. It just kind of glided, and it maybe went 8-10 feet and just dissipated.
In an investigation in Vandalia, Chris Mason had an experience that nearly made him quit ghost hunting forever, when the apparitions of 2 children literally passed through him.
We were in Vandalia on an investigation at a local business there, and we were on the 2nd floor. A picture was taken, and in the camera flash, a few of the other investigators saw 2 little kids in this room. I was the one that happened to take the picture. I was standing in a doorway. Apparently these little kids were looking at me, and they decided to run. Well, they ran through me, and I could feel them go through me. I got cold chills, and after that happened, I blacked out for about 5 minutes, apparently started crying, saying odd things to the other investigators, just strange things. And this went on not only there, but went on for about 2 weeks at my house. I would just be driving down the road and start crying. I actually had to have a psychic come in and help me. The little boy somehow attached to me and stayed with me. And she had to cleanse me in the house and everything. But that was a scary, yeah, but it was more emotional than anything. I didn't expect that to happen, but it did. And it's real, I'm telling you. It was just a startling event that I could feel his emotions for a few weeks, and he was pretty sad young man. I don't know why they were there. I don't know how that happened, but it did. Like that, I don't even like to talk about that much, honestly, but we have the proof of it, so.
But these veteran paranormal investigators say seeing apparitions is not the norm. They say when investigating alleged haunted locations, like the Legacy Theater, they commonly attempt to record spirit voices on digital recorders. Another tool to capture ghostly voices is nicknamed the Spirit Box, which moves rapidly across radio frequencies, allowing investigators to sometimes get immediate audio responses to their questions.
The Spirit Box, I wanted to ask something that was kind of a future type thing, but we could verify quickly. So I said, can you tell us where the next major earthquake will be? And I mean, immediately Ecuador came through. Next morning, I Googled the National Geological Survey. I asked that question about 1:05 a.m. Central Time. 1:31 Central Time, Ecuador had a 4.8 earthquake.
That's crazy.
Which was the next largest earthquake for several hours after that. So
The Spirit Box, I mean,
What is picked up on the Spirit Box?
it's just, they believe it manipulates the radio frequencies to speak. White noise comes through, it scans the frequencies, they come through on different frequencies. I wouldn't have thought that thing works, but I'm 100% convinced.
I turned it on in my house one day. I was sitting there doing paperwork at my desk, and I thought this is probably a dumb idea to turn this on at my house, but I did. And as soon as I hit that button, I sat it down and I hear a female go, "Hi!" And I'm like, oh, geez. And then I waited like 30 more seconds and I hear, "Hello!" And then I hear, "Hi!" again. I'm like, that's it. And I shut it off.
Is that anything really talking to you, or is it just some despondent voice?
We think that they know we're trying to hear them, and eventually they find you. I think they know people like us are out there trying to communicate, or at least trying to record voices, and they know where to come, and it's just hard to believe, but it happens. I mean, you shouldn't get any clear voices coming through.
Just a question. Do you feel it getting colder in here?
Yeah.
I do too.
But it could
the
be
temperature's
too.
dropping. I feel colder.
Joe, are the stories true? The reason that you committed suicide? Did you take money from work? Or did you believe you had no way to defend yourself?